Now I wanted to ask you. Now, you were raising children and married at this time. Now, how did I know I had
I
talked
left my,
to Evelyn about trying to juggle it.
I had left my husband. I had my children. I had my children with me. They were very young, but my mother, when I was going anywhere, my mother always had my children. I never left them.
Oh.
I would take my mother my mother was still living on Fairmount Avenue. And I was living at 53rd and Pine Streets.
Okay, so your mom had accepted the fact that you were a professional.
Yes, now by then.
So she was helping you with the child care and everything. So that's how you were doing.
Oh yes, because we didn't have child care. Remember, you didn't have where you could take. You didn't have a preschool.
No, we still don't.
None of
really.
No. And my mother would have, if I had to work at night, my mother did this. And then I had a second mom who lived next door to me, who had a daughter that was about 18 that still lived with her. So if I had to go any place out of town, then if my children didn't go with my mother, they were at Mrs. Smith's house. They didn't stay in the house. Mrs. Smith's daughter would come and watch them, if I was going to come home that night at 1 or 2 o'clock. But if I had to go out of town, my children were always up my mother's house or over to Mrs. Smith. I never, ever left them. I was working with different groups. I was working down at the Sahara that was on 16th Street, right off of South Street. I worked at the postal card. Juanita Sims had the postal card, and with the different groups that I worked with. By this time, we're getting up to like the 70s. We're getting into the 70s.
Let's backtrack a little bit. I wanted to ask you, Sam Reed told me that Spider Kelly's was primarily a black audience.
Yes. Well, no.
No?
No.
Because he said like Peps and the Showboat would be integrated, but Spider Kelly's for some reason.
Well, it was to a degree, but you had Caucasians that patronized it, but it was just about a black club, yes.
Not so much, or unlike, say, the Showboat or Peps.
That's true. But then you have to listen, Peps had more renowned artists coming in, and Showboat.
Right.
Peps, Spider Kelly's was owned by Buddy Caldwell, a black owner. And not because it was a black owner, but he was getting more of the local talent to come in. Like I said, I worked at Harold Corbin had that all sewed up. But after Harold died, I started working different places, going different places. I worked in Asbury Park, and I got that job. I just went to visit a girlfriend of mine, and they had a group working in Asbury Park, Morris Manton. And she went over to him and she said, my girlfriend's a singer from Philadelphia, blah, 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 yeah. And And she wants to do a tune. We don't really, blah. But then he didn't even remember, and he said, he did this to me. I went up, he said, what's your name? I said, Pearl Williams. He said, okay, and he got on the mic, and I don't know what he said. Pearlie, something. I got up and sang, blew him away. I worked with him a year and a half.
Really?
Morris Manson.
In Asbury Park.
in Asbury
Yeah,
Park.
drive all the way up there. Wow.
Sure did. Friday and Saturday night. But they had a Sunday afternoon matinee. And I met them. I met the Mitchell Ruff duo playing there on a Sunday, and it blew me away. You know, I didn't know them. I knew Dwight Mitchell's wife, Evelyn. She played organ. I met her at the Candlelight in Trenton. I worked with Johnny Williams, drummer. This is really funny. I worked with Johnny Williams, drummer. We had a group called Johnny Williams and the Foxettes. It was Myrtle Young,
Oh, Myrtle, yeah.
Goldie Hill, and myself and Johnny Williams. And we were working at the Candlelight. R.V. Powell was the owner. Candlelight's still going now. Jim Holton was just there. And a guy came up to us and said, "You know what? You guys sound fabulous." He said, "All you need to do is get a drummer." But he forgot that it was the drummer's group. We couldn't fire Johnny. But I was working down at the Sahara, and I had a guy, Al Thomas, who was my pianist. I don't know what happened to him. He drunk, got high or something. And Mrs. Scott told me, if you can't get a piano player that can be responsible, she said, because this isn't a dive. This is a supper club. I called Oliver Collins. Oliver was out of town. So the fellow that was playing bass, his name was Johnny Farrell. He was from Wilmington. He said, "I know a piano player who used to play for Dakota State, and he'd be glad to come up here." I said, "Well, can he drive?" She said, "No." He said, "No." Said that, I don't think he has a car, but I'll call him." I said, "Well, listen, Miss Scott's getting ready to give this gig to somebody else, and I'd like to stay down here." I don't know who was at the postal card for home base at that time, but I wanted to stay at the postal card. I wanted to stay at the Sahara. It was so nice. It's comfy. It you know, had a little pizzazz to it. The people weren't coming in there with sneakers on and T-shirts and hat on backwards. They weren't loud. Most of them were dressed. I have never gone to a performance when I wasn't dressed for the occasion. I don't care what my audience looked like, because I'm particular about the way that I look, the way that I speak. So he gives me this telephone number. I said, "Well, what's the guy's name?" He said, "His name is Gerald Price." And I called him. I said, "Johnny Farrell recommended you." I said, "I have a job at the Sahara." I said, "And we did a matinee." I said, "Can you make it for the 9:20 show tonight?" He said, "Yes, I can get the train up." I said, "Well, I'll pick you up at the station and bring you to the club." Well, that was the beginning of something else. When I heard him play, it was all over. All other pianists that I had heard were all out the window, you know. Fell in love with this piano player's, you know, talents. And we started working together. When Gerald wasn't in Philadelphia, he was working in Wilmington. He had left Dakota State, and he was working in Wilmington. And he had called me a couple of times, and we did a couple of gigs in Wilmington. I met Millie Cannon. That's when I met, who was an excellent vocalist, and I met Clifford Brown. As a matter of fact.
So this is in the 50s now, but we're back in the...
No. This is the 60s.
Clifford Brown died in 1956.
Well, then I met... Wait a minute. When did I meet? No, I didn't meet. I met Clifford Brown through Richie Powell.
Back
In the 50s.
In the 50s. When I met Gerald, I met Clifford Brown's widow, who lived in there. Now,
all right.
Millie Cannon's brother was Lem Winchester, Viber harpist. Lem Winchester was married to Clifford Brown's sister.
Okay.
Lem Winchester died in 1959 in Indianapolis. I think he was playing Russian roulette.
Oh.
Whoa.
Yeah, he was playing Russian roulette.
I know we're talking about Gerald Price in the 60s, but
I want to tell you that.
Yeah.
But
Clifford Brown, when you talk about when you met him with Richie Powell back
I met him when Richie Powell was living at the Trinity Apartments. That's the first time that I met Clifford Brown. But you got to remember, I was very young then. I was singing in McCoy's mother's beauty shop in the back. And that's when I first met, I never met him. The first time I heard about Coltrane.
Oh.
Okay.
But I met Clifford Brown through Richie Powell, Bud's brother, who lived in Philadelphia at that time. But Clifford Brown's sister was married to Lem Winchester, who was Millie Cannon, the vocalist from Wilmington's sister. That's and of course Gerald and them, they were all connected. Gerald and I used to work on King Street. I can't think of the name of the club, but we used to work at a club on King Street, and we used to do something called August Quarterly, that they had this big parade that they had in August. But Gerald started working for a while. I had joined 274, and every Sunday we would go down to 274. And I was coming home. And I was involved in an automobile accident at 23rd and Christian. Almost lost my life. And I stayed, that was in September, and I stayed in the hospital until December. I was hospitalized at the Mercy Douglas Hospital at 50th and Woodland. And when I came home, of course, I was laid up for quite some time. But then at that time, I had to get another group together. And I, just started with different piano players. However, before I had that terrible accident in September, I had been working with Tony Williams at a club called 21 something Arch Street.
Oh, I know what talking about.
I
Forget
can't,
the name of it, but I know.
but it was 20, and it was at 21st in Orange. And I was working with Tony and Eddie Green. And that was Tony. I do believe it. I'm not sure if it was Bubba, Tyrone Brown. I think it was Tyrone Brown and Al Jackson.
Yeah, they all went together.
That was the group. 21 something Arch Street.
I wanted to ask you, now this is after your accident, right?
This is after my accident.
Did you have, locally, how were you after the accident, especially with your lung? Were there any adaptations you had to make, or?
No. Well, you know, I was seeing a pulmonologist, and they started giving me breathing exercises. And when I would sing, I kept saying I don't sound like I sang before, but what I had to do, I started rephrasing. And then I liked the way I sound. So I continued with it. Some things just came naturally. When I felt that I was coming out of, getting out of breath, sometimes I would double or triple a note. And I like this. And if you listen to some of my songs that I sing, as a matter of fact, I'm going to give everybody a CD. You will like it. But when I was working with Eddie, I told Tony, I said, I want you to meet someone. And I introduced Tony to Gerald Price. They fell in love. That was a marriage really made, a musical marriage made in heaven. And they started working with the Bynum brothers at Zanzibar Blue when it was on 11th Street.
Right, 11th Pine.
They hired a girl, which I never understood since I hooked this up, but they hired Juanita Holiday. But Juanita was a different type singer than I.
Right.
And this is what they wanted. This, because, as Tony would say, you are more of a cocktail lounge restaurant singer.
Right.
Now remember, Zanzibar Blue was mixed.
Right. Right.
It was mixed. It was mixed. It was different on 11th Street than it was at the Bellevue, because when it was at the Bellevue, I worked there with Webb Thomas.
Right.
But Buzzy said to me, you just don't fit in. Because I said, damn it. I introduced him to Tony and they hired Juanita. Excellent. But she pulled out. They loved her.
Yeah.
They loved her.
Now, I wanted to ask you about something else here. It's and I ask it of everybody who's a woman in jazz, because the predominance of men in jazz. How did you find dealing in a man's world in a genre of music that's also primarily men that you're working with? How did you did you ever come up against any kind of sexism?
Yes.
You have the floor.
Yes. But I am so proud to say that with all of the groups that I have ever worked with